James Schamus is a professor of professional practice of film and media studies at Columbia University and has been one of the faculty members who has been most vocal and eloquent on the subject of defending academic freedom in this moment of really extraordinary peril that we face. And he's also just he's under any circumstances a busy guy, but I can imagine how unbelievably busy he is now. So, James, I'm really grateful that you can do this.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
So there's so much happening and so much happening even at Columbia that I thought I'm going to start with really a broad question that you can really take anywhere, which is, how do you make sense of what is happening to Columbia University and what is happening at Columbia University right now?
Well, thanks so much for starting off with a question that's impossible to answer in a few minutes, let alone an hour or a few days. I think the imperative to make sense of what's going on is an important one, and it's also important in this moment to drop that imperative and move into action, knowing that it's very difficult for any of us, even collectively, to have the cognitive and emotional capacity to take in everything that's going on. If I had my druthers in this hour I'm sharing with you and everybody on this Zoom, I would probably suggest an hour of silence, just so that we take a breath from social media, from our chat groups, from our signal groups, from our emails, from our social media, private lists, everything else, and take in the enormity of what's happening. The enormity is such that it is difficult in moments like these to pretend that any of us could articulate an overview, because the assaults are coming so quickly and they're coming from so many different directions. But they do appear to perform at least patterns that are recognizably identifiable from those of us, even with the back of the history book blurb acquaintance with the kinds of histories that many of us have experienced, or our parents and grandparents certainly did. The rise of whatever you want to call it, fascism, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, oligarchic, criminal gangsterism. And we can parse the differences in this moment of what's happening. But I would say the following, just representing a feeling, an affect. And that is, for those of us who took note in the past year and a half at the complicity of all of the institutions that hold some measure of power in the so-called liberal democracies of the West, in particular the United States, in the exterminationist assault on the Palestinian people. We've noticed that in and of itself being somebody's goal, but also at the same time, we have to hold these two things together. It is a pretext and a fig leaf for an overall assault on the very notion of democratic governance and human rights everywhere. So making that connection between what's happened just this week to Mahmoud Khalil and to everybody who's on this call is an important one to make, to the understanding that all of us are in this together.
So why do you think Columbia University in particular was made an example of? I mean, Columbia has actually been bending over backwards to basically repress pro-Palestinian activism and speech. I mean, right, they suspended Jewish Voice for Peace and I think Students for Justice in Palestine within just a few months of the protests starting. So why do you think that of all the universities that Columbia was the one that the Trump administration decided to make an example of?
Well, it's always counterintuitive and, again, perhaps uncognizable unless you're living in the moment with these paradoxes and antinomies to say it. But one reason that Columbia is being held out as the first and primary example and the first sacrificial victim to the Musk-Trump regime is precisely because to a great portion of their so-called base, a base that they're going to very quickly desert as they consolidate their power and have no need for them anymore, Columbia is being attacked precisely because it is Jewish, right? Our co-chairs of the Board of Trustees, so many faculty, we're in New York City, we're liberal, we're woke, we're this, we're that. We represent a kind of cosmopolitan ideal that in the anti-Semitic and I would say essentially Nazi ideology that's driving a lot of the assault on American higher education, they can have it both ways. They can get a very pliable administration to bully and to do their bidding in the name of Jewish freedom, But in fact, to their base, they all know that when they give these sig heils and when they send out all these anti-Semitic shalom memes, what they're really doing is going after the Jews. I've written a little bit about this in the piece that was posted on LitHub last week. It already seems like a text from an ancient civilization. Things are happening so quickly. But I do want to stress that the cultural, political, ideological context of the assault on higher education is itself fundamentally anti-Semitic, and the use of Zionism and of the supposed protection of Jews is a very effective, very clever, and very powerful cover for a global totalitarian movement that's coming after us.
Right. But it's also true that there are Jewish organizations, some of the most prominent in America, like the Anti-Defamation League, and Jewish people in American politics who have relationships with Trump, who are endorsing this, right? And who themselves frame this as a defense of Jewish safety.
Yeah, well, there are people who claim that the world is flat. And so the idea that at this day and date we can call the ADL a Jewish organization, I think, is something that we should self-correct on. These are no longer, they may be organizations that collect a large number of Jewish Americans and Israeli Americans into them. But to claim that they're Jewish organizations now, I think we can put that into the dustbin of history. They are just flat out apologists for ethno-nationalist ideologies that are aligning themselves, as they often do, in the interests of the oligarchies that connect them and the types of fascistic political formations that support them.
But you seem to be kind of defining Jewish as somehow inextricably linked to liberal or cosmopolitan. I mean, there are many Jews for whom their Jewish identity is and always has been, is linked to a much, much more tribal and illiberal and authoritarian worldview, just like there are people of every different religious tradition who hold these range of political views.
No, I'm not defining Jewishness in any way. I'm definitely defining the ADL, however, is not particularly Jewish at this moment. I'm arguing against the conflation of the kind of ideology and politics that they practice with what Judaism is. They can act in the name, obviously, of Jewishness, and they can act as a collectivity that speaks with and for and to a large proportion of Jewish Americans. But that's a large proportion that, as you know, Peter, given the journey that you've been on the past decade, is one that is shrinking. It's not clear, however, that the now, I believe, majority Jewish position on just some fundamental human rights issues as they relate to American support for the Netanyahu regime in Israel, it has that much of an impact anymore, at least at the moment, on these claims. But I would still say it's important to assert them.
How do you interpret the way that the Columbia University administration has been responding, since these attacks began more than a year ago, and then the way that they're now responding now as this pressure is dramatically intensifying? What's their strategy? How do you understand the culture of the university leadership that explains the way they've responded?
I don't think I can add any commentary or analysis that's much more sophisticated than what probably everybody listening in and watching on this Zoom gets in their daily social media feed. We are essentially students, faculty, and staff of this university bystanders, but to the performance, on the one hand, of exhortations to, staying together as a community that supports certain fundamental values of academic and human rights and freedoms. And on the other hand, we're seeing what you're seeing. We're seeing the exact same thing, which is, the phrase going around is, or we want to put it, obedience in advance, or whatever it is. We're watching it happen in real time. So obviously, these are members of the administration. Many of them are colleagues. These are the people that we share space with at this university. If we're going to survive in any shape or form as an enterprise that we have any reason to be proud of being a part of, these will continue to be our colleagues after this. So I think it's important to, on the one hand, continue with the trenchant criticisms, objections, and protestations against what they're doing, and also understand that they are part of an institution that, for all of our fundamental critiques of, is one that still has given many people great space to inquire, debate, think, teach, learn. And so we want to, as best we can, fight to preserve that space. All institutions, Columbia University, the New York Jets. They all act and walk and talk like institutions, and you can say, oh, that's a thing. But in fact, they are also places and spaces, some of them affective, intellectual, emotional, also spatial, that provide opportunities for people to interact in ways that often in the rest of society we don't get the chance to. We want to fight to preserve that in particular.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.